Hello, everyone, and welcome to our District Administration Ed Talk here today, which is entitled Student Engagement Using Phenomena. And all of this is brought to you by the general support of our sponsor with us here today, Carolina Science. Now for some quick housekeeping items, and we'll get right to the presentation. At the end of our event, there will be a live Q&A with a panel. You can submit your questions at any time from now until then below via the red Ask Question icon with the question mark at any time during the event. There are also some resources that you can safely access, and those are in the blue related content icon with the paperclip, and that is also at the bottom of your screen there. There is also a poll that we'll be launching during the presentation. The poll, it will appear where you can see the slides now. To participate, just click directly on the slide and your answer will be recorded. Also, we invite you to please stay on until the very end to participate in our post-event survey. It'll launch right when the event ends, so please stay on. We'd love to hear from you. And lastly, everyone who is here today and those who registered, all of you will receive an email tomorrow from us at DA with a link to the slides. And with that, it now is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have Cory Ort, who is National Science Consultant at Carolina Science, and we also have with us Karen Stevens, who is Vice President of Curriculum at Carolina Science. Cory, Karen, it's great to have you with us today. You may now begin.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Cory Ort. I'm the National Science Consultant. I've been in education for 25 some odd years. I know I have a limited amount of time with you today, about 20 minutes, and we want to leave 10 minutes for the Q&A, so I'm just going to dive right in to the presentation. We're going to be talking a lot about phenomenon in the next 20 minutes, and it's just one of those buzzwords that we hear all the time in science education is phenomenon. I was at NSTA last spring, and I started looking through all the workshops, and almost every single workshop had the word phenomenon somewhere in the description. And we hear it every place we go. We see it in our standards now. And so we're going to look at three different aspects in how phenomenon-based science works in the classroom. First, we're going to kind of try and answer the question, why? Why is phenomenon science so prevalent right now? Two, what are some things you can do right now in your school district and in your classrooms to start integrating phenomenon into your existing curriculum? And then three, some of the results of a phenomenon-based science approach. But before we get started, let's answer probably the question of the day, and that is, what is a phenomenon? So here is your poll. We've given some items up there on the poll, and we're simply asking, which of these things do you think is a phenomenon? A flower growing in a sidewalk crack, a solar eclipse that's coming here in April and in October, actually, hummingbird at a feeder, reflection in a window, changing shadow length through the day and through the seasons, a litter of puppies. Which one of these things do you think is a phenomenon? So I'm going to give you a few moments here. Click your answer. And just so you know, I'm not going to tell you what the right answer is right now. You're going to have to wait till a little bit later in the presentation to find out what the answer to this poll question actually is. If any of you have children or have been in the classroom recently, I am sure you have heard this question be asked. Why do I need to know this? It is one of those questions every single year as a teacher you get from a student. When will I ever use this? How does this help me? How does this relate to me? We hear that all the time, and sometimes as teachers we get frustrated by students saying those or asking those questions. But through the presentation today, I hope to kind of reframe what the student's actually asking when they say that they're really asking something different. It's not trying to be disrespectful or anything else, but when a student asks whether they're kindergartners or whether they're seniors, why do I need to know this? And if you've got kids, I am sure just like my 17-year-old and my 14-year-old, you've heard them say this to you as you're helping them with their homework. Why do I need to know this? Well, let's start with that first aspect now of what we want to talk about. Why are you seeing phenomenon everywhere? Every state show, in the standards, every place we go in education, we hear that word phenomenon. First off, 48 of the 50 states have adopted standards that are either NGSS or based on the frameworks. That is a huge shift to three-dimensional learning. And just as kind of a reminder, what do we mean by three-dimensional learning? Well, 1/3 of the three dimensions is the content, what we are traditionally thinking of science, that kind of idea of what's Newton's first law, how does a cell divide, what is plate tectonics? It's the content, it's the disciplinary core idea. But 2/3, and just as important as that content is, it's the cross-cutting concepts, or what we call in my home state, the recurring themes and concepts, but that idea of those things that start to extend science beyond the classroom: patterns, scale and proportion, cause and effect, those bigger pictures we want students to be able to understand. And then the third is the science and engineering practices, that ability to communicate and think scientifically, asking questions, thinking about investigations, communicating what you understand, modeling. Those ideas are now making up in 48 states, they're making up our standards. And that shift has occurred for just a very obvious reason. If you haven't really stopped and thought about it, it's the fact that the students have all of the content at their fingertips, literally in their hands. They have all of human knowledge by simply saying, Alexa or Siri, what is Newton's first law? How does a cell divide? That information comes flooding at them. And so this shift to three-dimensional learning kind of embraces that approach and trying to engage students in that critical thinking, that when I get the information, how do I use it? How do I model it? How do I ask questions to be able to understand it? How do I apply it to a new phenomenon? Then the idea of figuring out and answering those questions. And so you're seeing the shift in all the standards all through the country of it's no longer about the stuff of science. The stuff of science being the facts. It's starting to shift to more around the story about those facts, about that stuff, that connection, the ability to think around a phenomenon. And we see that as we engage with students in terms of the intention of these standards is to focus students on gaining an understanding and transferring that science knowledge, that stuff, to new skills and to different problems and phenomenon. Because now they can literally just ask, and they have the perfect definition. They have the explanation, but they don't really own it. They don't actually have it in such a way where they can apply it. And any of us who've been in the classroom recently, observing teachers teach, we see that. We see that the students struggle with those connections. And that's from our most advanced students to the students that I teach that are really struggling. They all have those common struggles about connecting the information, the stuff, with the story, what they see every day. And phenomenon truly helps them connect it. And so that's kind of an explanation of why you're seeing phenomenon so many places and all around the country. Well, the next thing is, let's actually talk about when you step into a classroom that's phenomenon based, some of those things that you would like to be able to see teachers doing and engaging with the students to kind of help shift those questions we talked about at the very beginning. First question we have to ask is, what is a phenomenon? And this answers the poll. A phenomenon is anything that you can observe. So guess what? If you picked any of those answers, you're right. You picked a phenomenon. A plant growing in the crack of a sidewalk, a hummingbird at a feeder, a solar eclipse. Anything you can observe is a science phenomenon. A pin falling to the ground. That's a phenomenon. It doesn't have to be. When phenomenon first came in about 10, 12 years ago, we thought of it as these huge, giant, really super cool activities or videos we show the kids, and the kids all go, wow. And it hooked them in for a day or two. And then all of a sudden it was back to that traditional instruction. We didn't use the phenomenon to teach science. We used it to kind of bait the kids initially. And we wound up going back to that same traditional instruction. So when you first start thinking about working with your teachers about what phenomenon is, look around the room. there's a phenomenon there. Take a second right now and look around where you're sitting. Do you see a scientific phenomenon right in your office, right in that classroom? I'm going to tell you right now, I can look outside and I can see the hummingbird feeder I intentionally put right in front of my window. And the reason why is I like watching the hummingbirds, but that's a phenomenon. And you think about why. So much science is there: structure and function, energy within a biological system. All the content is there when you watch that hummingbird move. It's amazing to think about what kids can come up with their phenomenon when you have that definition of anything you can observe is a phenomenon. When we start talking about phenomenon-based instruction, there are 4 key things. And this is one of those things that teachers right now, tomorrow, can start to implement to get phenomenon into their classroom. And so first, when you introduce a phenomenon to a student, allow the students a moment to observe and explore the phenomenon. Most commonly, that's done in like a T-chart of notices and wonderings. And you think about it, no matter what type of student you're talking about, every student can watch that hummingbird at the feeder, can watch a rocket taking off, can watch an MRE mill react, or see syrup coming out of a tree, and notice things. I noticed that the hummingbird has a long beak. I noticed the hummingbird moves really quickly. I noticed the liquid in the container is different colors. I've seen blue, I've seen red. See, they move quickly from flower to flower, sticking their nose in it. I notice all of these things. I notice in my office right now a reflection in the window. Well, I see myself. They can do the notices, and those notices lead to natural wonderings. Why does the hummingbird have the long beak? Why doesn't every bird have a long beak? Why doesn't every bird fly that fast? And these are all questions that the students have that engages them with the phenomenon. And so this first step of allowing students to look and start to pique their curiosity, as opposed to just showing them a super cool video and then we just move on. Giving them that opportunity is something simple that they see every day, and that notice and wondering, and writing it down. So as they move through the unit, they can start to answer their wonders. Then the second part of bringing phenomenon into your classroom is allowing the students to attempt to explain the phenomenon. Allowing students that opportunity to use what they already know. And I always like to use this one as an example, is the Mount Everest idea when we started to introduce plate tectonics. When we introduced plate tectonics, I had a student who swore up and down the reason why Mount Everest grew was the snow. The snow fell down and it landed on the top of Everest and compacted, and that started to cause it to grow. And the snow that reached the valley floor pushed down on the floor and lifted Everest up. Now, I could have, as a teacher, taken 15 minutes in a lecture and told them all about plate tectonics and how the plates bang together, moves due to convection in the mantle, all of those things. 20 minutes later, if you would have bumped into that student in the hallway, what would have been their answer to the exact same question? My answer or their answer? Giving students that opportunity to create a model. And we all say we do a lot of modeling in our class, but most of the time we model of something. Let's make a model of the solar system. Let's make a model of a cell, as opposed to trying to use a model to explain a phenomenon, a model for explanation. And so that ability, and not to correct the students. If Karen was one of my students and she had the most ridiculous model whatsoever, I wouldn't correct it. That's room for growth for Karen as she moves through the unit to look back in her model and go, oh, wow, I can change this, I can change that. But that ability to actually examine it. The third piece that really is great for in the classroom when you introduce a phenomenon that you're going to teach with is identifying related phenomena. Allowing the students that time to go home and home learning and experience, create a list of similar phenomenons. Where else have they seen a bird eating? Where else have they seen these ideas tied together? The reflection one I was mentioning earlier. Think about as many times in the day that you see a reflection and have those students come back with, I saw the phenomenon at home. I saw the phenomenon here. I saw the phenomenon there. I'm a football coach, And when we did forces and the related phenomenon, the kids stopped saying at practice, did you see that hit? It was, did you see the phenomenon? That application of force, did you see how that worked? That engagement of the students, and they see the things we're talking about in the science classroom every single day around them, that list of related phenomena. And the fourth big piece for teachers when they try and bring phenomenon in their classroom, allow the students to use their wonderings, their noticings, their models, their related phenomenon to generate their questions. Those pieces that their model doesn't quite explain, their explanation doesn't quite explain. The snow falling down explains possibly why Mount Everest grows, but not why it moves 4 centimeters a year. That student, despite their misconception, still has a question to contribute. And these 4 pieces are done individually with the student, but also as a class to help start to establish that classroom culture of we're a scientific community, that we're all here to move our science thinking forward. And so not only do I have my students observe and explore the phenomena and create their notice and wondering chart, then we share out and create a class notice and wondering chart. So every student gets to put their notices and their wonderings up on the board. We develop a class consensus model. What are the pieces that we all agree on? So when Karen turns and shares her model with her partner, they come to an understanding of, oh, we have these things similar, but we have these things different. What did the rest of the class do? And I'm never going to tell Karen to change her model, but what can we agree on? What do we think as a whole explains this? The related phenomenon is a class model. Everyone gets a chance to contribute where else they saw the phenomenon, and everyone can contribute a question. You really start building that overall classroom community when you're using phenomenon. And the students and the teacher can use this phenomenon to guide their instruction. So instead of just doing the investigation, we're doing an investigation. We go back to our questions. We go back to our wonderings. We go back to our model and say, how does this help us explain what we saw? So you start to see what I mean about that idea that it's not about the stuff, it's the story around the stuff. When you're trying to teach in the 3 dimensions of learning, you've got to be able to frame it in the story about the science. So that way kids start to see cause and effect. They have a reason to communicate and ask questions and think about an investigation. And so when you start to introduce phenomenon into any curriculum, these are some 4 things that right now as administrators and teachers in the classroom and science coaches in the classroom, you can go in and say, you know, when we launch the next unit, let's look around for a simple phenomenon and let's do these 4 things. And I'm telling you, as a classroom teacher, the shift in the way the kids approach the science classroom. Because I constantly tell students who say, I don't like science to me, say, I've never met anybody who doesn't like science, but I do know some students who don't like the way science is taught. We're all curious. We all ask why. How many times in the day we say why? And when you bring this into your science classroom, some of the results you will see immediately with the students is you're engaging their natural curiosity and sparking questions. You're motivating students to start to make those connections to what we're talking about in science, whether it's transparent, translucent, and opaque. 3 words we show them, but we don't show it how they applies to what they see every day. It helps students apply their content to the outside world. And you think about the 3 dimensions of learning and the idea of scale and proportion and cause and effect, and how that applies to just simply introducing a phenomenon to the students. It helps students generate those skills that go beyond the science classroom. Cause and effect is as important in the English classroom, and the history classroom, and the math classroom as it is the science classroom. And every student gets a voice, regardless of whether they're struggling with the language, they're struggling in mathematics. Phenomenon can give every student that voice, that ability to tie their experience to what they're talking about. And that's why, again, phenomenon is anything you can observe. So back to that very beginning questions. Think about now when you hear that 4th grader, that 6th grader, that sophomore, actually ask the question, why do I need to know this? Kind of stop and think about really what they're asking. They're not seeing the three dimensions. They're seeing the stuff. And they don't see how the stuff does what? Relates to them. Tie it to them. That they're not trying to be disrespectful. They're not trying to say, I don't like science. They're saying is, I don't see how it ties to me. And by relating it to phenomena and allowing them to do their models. And I'll give you one last story before we go to question and answer. And I'm going to throw my son under the bus here for a second. He's a 17-year-old junior, and he took AP Chem last year. Did very well in the course, got a good grade on the AP exam. And him and his buddies were over at my house playing Xbox. Big shocker, 17-year-olds playing Xbox. And I had an extra MRE meal. And I asked them to come down. I told them I was going to cook them a meal with just water. And they came down. I cut it up, poured the water in the bag, sealed it up. And they watched it get hot. They were touching it. They watched it expand. And these are all young men and women who took AP Chem. And I got the question, how does this work? And think about that for a second. Every one of them passed the AP exam. They knew the content. They could do the math. They missed the phenomenon, how it relates to me and where I see these things. So that's kind of a quick, I know it's only 20 minutes. I'm actually already a minute something over my 20 minutes, so I need to be quiet and get to question and answers with Karen. When you go to do your question and answers, if you don't mind, please, excuse me, please put them in the question and answer chat, because that's what Karen's watching to help kind of answer some of our questions. So.
Thank you, Cory. I did want to just comment. It occurs to me, obviously I've heard this presentation before, I know this, but it really struck me even differently today. All you talked about was students. A little bit about what are teachers doing, but it's all about the students and the story of your son. Really, it is about that application. So it's taking what they've learned and being able to apply it to a new situation and demonstrate true learning. So it is, but for students, it's about, making it meaningful to them.
Before we get into questions, I just realized I skipped over this one slide. I was so excited to get to the questions. These are all, because we're in such a tight time frame, these are all papers that kind of support using phenomena in the classroom. Some of them talk about the benefits of phenomenon. Some of them talk about how to implement those driving question boards, putting that as the center of that science instruction. And these are all resources that can be provided from Carolina. They're as part of the resources that come along with this webinar. And also, by the way, if you are looking to do some professional learning on phenomenon, Carolina is more than happy to provide that. It can be done virtually for just an hour or two, or an all-day in-person workshop of how to take phenomenon and integrate it into the curriculum you already have. It doesn't have to be a whole new curriculum. You think about those 4 elements. It's just the idea of how you use that phenomenon, making the story that teachers are telling about the stuff around them, the students. So I forgot, I was so excited I forgot to actually explain those links to you guys.
No problem. So we do have a few questions. Let me start. When do you revisit phenomenon as you teach?
So as
I'm
you
getting
teach,
into the practical, like we said, as a teacher, how do I do this? How do I implement it?
So what you would do is you'd almost launch the unit by using one of the phenomena. Let's just say I'm doing chemical reactions in exothermic and endothermic evidences of chemical reactions in the middle school. You would show the kids the MRE mill, how that works. They fill it, they see how it works. They do their notice and wondering in all 4 of those steps. And then I would continue on teaching the students about chemical reactions. And we would still do the Ziploc bag mixture where we feel it get hot and feel it get cold. We do the conservation of mass. And then when we had covered several investigations and it was time to do sense making, and that's a huge part of phenomenon, is we do these investigations and they're generally designed to be confirmation of what the teacher's already said. Rather than confirming it with them, bring the students back to the phenomenon and say, here were some of the questions we had. Why, which of these questions did these investigations and these classroom discussions we had help us answer? And so, for example, with the MR email, my students constantly say, I see a bunch of gas escaping the top. Well, we measured the MRE mass before we did it, and after we measured that bag before and after. What does that help us explain? Well, the gas is mass leaving. Those tie-ins that students see, and then they go, oh, well, what happens if we did it with the related phenomenon of the Alka-Seltzer? And they tie it. So you revisit the phenomenon as you do your instruction to have the kids start to answer their questions. And it's them making the sense rather than me saying, do you know what that proved, Karen? That proved that there's a thing called the conservation of mass. The kids get the opportunity to see and then tie to the phenomenon.
Awesome. There's a couple of questions here that are a little related, so I'm going to ask them together. One is, do you use a new phenomena every time you start a unit? The other one is, my understanding of phenomena were unexplainable. So is this an effort to use the unexplained to hook students as you start a unit?
We do try and use a new unit for every, or a new phenomenon for every unit. But I do know some teachers who use like semester-long phenomenon. And I'll use my wife as an example, who's an 8th grade science teacher. She uses the rocket taking off to help do chemical reactions, because that's the ignition of the space shuttle taking off, through forces, which is her kind of first semester. And so she uses that all year long. The kids just keep coming back to it and coming back to it and coming back to it. A phenomenon isn't something that is unexplainable. And that's a common question. A phenomenon is anything that you can observe, and it's what the laws in science are based on. For example, the law of gravity is different than the theory of gravity. You can tell I'm a physics teacher at heart. The law of gravity is the phenomenon. It occurs. The pencil falls to the ground. That is the phenomenon, is what we base our law on. The theory is the explanation as to why it occurs. That can be Newtonian physics, attraction between masses, Einsteinian physics, bend in space-time. That's the difference between the phenomenon and the theory. And so the idea of using phenomenon that is unexplainable, all the phenomenon is explainable. For example, a one-way mirror, the hummingbird analogy. You can explain why the hummingbird does what it does, why it has the beak, why it moves so fast, all as the phenomenon of what you observed. So phenomenon doesn't have to be unexplainable. In fact, in science, our quest is to do what with phenomenon? Explain it.
Figure it out.
That is our driving purpose. And we're just taking the real science approach to the kindergartner, to the 5th grader, to the 7th grader. To them, it might be unexplainable. By the time they get to the unit, into the unit, they can explain a lot of it. And they may not be able to explain it all, but that's also the nature of science. I can't explain everything.
I was going to ask one more, but we are already at the bottom of the hour. Invite Stephen back in.
Perfect. Yeah, not a problem. And, and if there were any questions you didn't get to today, we at DA, we will be sharing them with our partners at Carolina Science, so they can get back to your questions individually after today's event. And actually, as I go through my closing slides in just a few moments, if any more questions do come to mind, feel free to continue putting them in the Q&A box there, and make sure to forward them over. But again, make sure also to stay on until the very end of our event to participate in our post-event survey. It'll pop up on your screen right when I close out in a few moments. So I do appreciate that. But first off, thank you again, to Cory and Karen, for sharing your expertise and time with us today. We really appreciate it. And of course, thank you to Carolina Science. And I'd also like to take a minute just to thank you, our audience, for joining us here today as well. For those of you who enjoyed our presentation, we have more DA Ed Talks like this one that are provided by us here at District Administration, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, as well as current issues in K-12. We have a wide range of readers, all of them subscribe for free to DA, and they stay up to date with us in our print magazine, online, our newsletters, web seminars, as DA Ed Talks like this one. Also, last thing, if you would like to watch this presentation again, or for those of you believe that what you heard here would be helpful to your colleagues in a case, you'll be pleased to know that the team at DA will be sending you an email at some point later tomorrow, and that email will include an on-demand recording as well as a link to the slides. So with that, on behalf of DA, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.